Shell to Sea and Manus. Manus and his daughter Sharifa went down to Rossport for the bank holiday weekend. There was a protest camp down there, benders and yaks, and a kitchen and toilets. Some kind of a deal had been done. Another dodgy politician had signed over ownership of Ireland's natural gas reserves to Shell Oil. It was a bit like your crooked uncle had sold the family farm, and now the family had to pay rent to live there. Just didn't make sense if you thought about it. Manus figured most people hadn't time to think much. The world was run that way, run by a few corporations. A hierarchical corporate empire, which regardless of what picture it presented of itself, cared for nothing, living or dead, in the past or in the future, cared for nothing but profit. And there'd be no storm in this empire's Bastille. This empire's Bastille was the whole section of the planet marked off as the third world market. And the West was going to keep those prison walls in place as long as it could. No, there would be no mass uprising in the West. There wouldn't even be any stopping the Shell Oil Corporation in Mayo, but you could slow them down. And other corporations would be slower to move into the coast of Ireland, so long as they saw some resistance. Manus wanted Sharifa to see some resistance. A whole camp full of people who hoped for a fairer, less hierarchical, more humane world. Manus was a bit dubious about the outdoor life. He had hemorrhoids, and the thoughts of having to wash the blood off his bum every morning in a portaloo was not an appealing one. He dreaded the big red stain spilling out in the seat of his pants as he sat round the campfire. Dreaded the awkwardness of his fellow protesters as they pointed out or ignored the stain. Oh, the ignobleness of the body. Maybe he could get one of those old-fashioned fanny pads his mother used to send him round to the chemist for with a note. He would receive the unholy, untouchable items in a brown paper bag, lest he be contaminated. Remember his sister getting dragged around by the hair and screamed at for having left one somewhere? A half a century later, and Manus would still be embarrassed, asking for Dr. White's sanitary towels. He wondered if they even still made them. All he ever saw these days were tampons. He wondered if he could stick one of them up his bum. Fuck, no, shit. Hopefully the hemorrhoids wouldn't be too bad when he was away. Anyway, what the hell, he had bleeding hemorrhoids. He had problems that weren't physical too. He'd been on his own too long. Not just physically, but emotionally. He needed to care and share with an individual, not just his daughter. In fact, she was one of the reasons he figured he should have someone else. It was wrong that he should be dependent on a 7-year-old daughter as his only source of love or affection. He needed an adult confidant, a friend. He made determined efforts. He went down to Shomer Spree Autonomous Social Centre for his meals and interacted with people as best he could. He wasn't much of a socialite. It's a slow process making friends. It takes time. He had flirted with a few women too, though that kind of thing, unless it actually gets realised, could all have been in his head. And it seldom did get realised with him. He lacked both confidence and a willingness to play the game. It had once been said of Manus that he not only expected women to come to his bed, but to turn the sheets down themselves. That was a little bit of an exaggeration. He would turn the sheets down for her, but it was true that if a woman wanted him, she had to make it very easy for him to get her. Meanwhile, he was taking Sharifa down to Rossport to see a little resistance to corporate rule. But he wasn't really in the best of moods for it. His lack of social interaction left him with an exaggerated sense of social ineptitude. Even on the train on the way down, he was already feeling awkward. Shit, what did he know about anything? With the rest of the protesters, he shared the basic premise that a few corporations shouldn't be allowed to rule the world. But other than that, they had little in common. Most of them looked like they had sampled drugs, but unlike him, they hadn't made drugs the core of their lives. As always, he had a half an eye out for a woman. He noticed Paula, long blonde hair, tight prim dress. He figured her veneer would scratch off pretty easy, but kind of liked it anyway, like a good barrister. Someone who could possibly be on the same side as him, but not the same social circle. Maybe on a wild celebratory party with way too much drink taken, she would even shag him. She would be bemused by his life stories. In his youth, Manus had seen himself as some kind of a free spirit, unwilling to give in to a brutal, dull, senseless, wasteful, greedy society. He felt like he had won a few rounds in the beginning, but it was a long fight, and he'd been losing regularly for time. So society, and he figured Paula, would only be able to see him as a beggar, a bum, a useless parasite on social security, and a drug-taking wastrel all his long life. Paula would tell him later that she had noticed him handing coins to a beggar outside the train station. She had found him attractive and assumed him kind because of his giving coins to the beggar. The journey took 6 hours, and it was dark when they put up their tent, with the midgies having a feast day on their flesh. Next day, he found it using a portaloo when he had bleeding hemorrhoids that you had to wash after you shit wasn't any worse than he had expected. And there he was, bodily functions operating at a protest camp. There was all kinds of meetings, which Manus tried attending, but soon got bored with. He had heard it before. He agreed with all they said, but found it difficult to sit and listen. Sharifa played in the kid's yak and was rude to him, telling him to get out when he called at the door. Normally he was good with Sharifa and met any rudeness with humour, but not this time. Sharifa and he fought, and he felt ridiculous and went to his tent and sat there on his own. Next he tried to force Sharifa to eat, another disaster. He went back to his tent. He felt the full weight of his failure in life. Papillon in his solitary confinement dreams, arriving at the gates of judgment and being accused of a wasted life. Manus had looked after his daughter since she was born. No one could say that was a waste. He had been good at looking after her too, his worth obvious in Sharifa's health and happiness. But maybe he wasn't any good as a dad after all. His own father had been around for the first 6 years of his life, and had provided Manus with a good example of how to nourish a child. But Sharifa was 7 now. Maybe Manus didn't have the knowledge to look after a child over the age of 6. Christ, what had he to offer as a child? He thought of going to England and leaving her to her socially acceptable, socially capable mother. He thought of suicide. He thought he was tired, overtired. He thought he had been living under stress for too long, with no backup, no comforter, no confidant. 3 of the older women in the camp, they were probably in their late 30s, early 40s, paid attention to him. One was a buck-toothed Irish girl who seemed genuine, so completely straight, Manus's rough edges jarred with her. Then there was a French woman with grey hair, an old hippie. She seemed more of a possibility. And then there was Paula, some Swedish woman who had come to the alternative worldview that corporations should not rule the planet opinion late in life. She often seemed to be at his side. He read some of his stories out round the fire. Paula showed interest in them, so he read her some more. She said the stories lacked any joy or contentment. He agreed with her. She seemed fairly rigid, and a bit like she would be feeling most at ease in some sort of conflict with him, like having a problem with him and walking away would suit her. He wondered if their little intimacies, personal history stories, and cigarettes and tea would end there at the camp. Another person who couldn't relate to him. She was staying on at the camp to take part in some action or to resist a possible eviction, whereas he had to get back Sharifa to her mother. And that could have been it, but they exchanged numbers and invitations to visit. She helped to carry the bags and ran holding Sharifa's other hand to catch the bus back to the train station. He smiled like a kid embarrassed after they hugged goodbye. It was a good feeling. He was old, but he wasn't dead. He thought about Paula. It wasn't straight lust. She was a big, flat-chested woman, blonde and Swedish, whatever that meant. They hadn't had sex, but he felt some kind of fidelity towards her. When he next saw any women whom he had previously flirted with, he noticed his active withdrawal from the flirtatious dance, however flimsy or imaginary such dances were. He had to wonder on that. Had he committed to this woman, Paula, already? And if so, why? Nothing had happened between them, or very little. They'd talked, they'd hugged goodbye. Hard to say if they'd even played any psychological footsie. He didn't think so. All Paula had done was put herself in his close proximity. Never had her actions crossed from the simply human to the sexually human. But Manus liked things simple, and he lowered his eyes when he imagined the women he had previously flirted with, flirting back. He was going to try something with that woman, Paula. She wasn't dirty fairy or dippy hippie. She was a straightforward, hard-headed woman. He sang a song in his head, looking for a hard-headed woman, one who'll make me do my best. And when I find that hard-headed woman, I know the rest of my life will be blessed. He wasn't 100% sure he was looking for any kind of a woman now that it came to it. It was hard to imagine. And it was hard to give credit to the notion that any woman or anything else would make the rest of your life blessed. But still, he sang a song and pondered the notion. Sharifa was Manus's main worry. He hated the thought of her life being so complicated. Bad enough that her parents were not friends and lived in separate houses, and severed Sharifa's little life and heart in two. Then the added complication of her separate parents and their separate partners and their families. Shit, the poor child. Jan too, he worried over. Would she ever come to regret her actions? Would she ever miss him and Sharifa and the life they could have had together? Had I ever really gotten over the desire for Jan and Sharifa and him as a unit? Still, a week or so and a few text messages later, Manus went up to visit Paula. She lived in the mountains. Embarrassed he felt. A kid, he felt like. He didn't know what he was looking for. A friend, he figured. He wondered if the friendship, if it happened, would be physical. He had the jitters of a teenager inside his old body. He tried to catch himself on. It didn't have to be a sexual relationship. He didn't even know if he wanted a sexual relationship with Paula. He didn't even think he could have sex anymore. Hemorrhoids again. They would be too embarrassing, and were bound to put her off. Plus, he smoked too much, and it had to be reducing the blood flow to his dick. But more than any of these, he was scared of the hurt he would inevitably feel. Each stroke of pleasure paid back tenfold in pain. His recent sexual relationships hadn't been relationships to the women. To the women, they had just been sexual. He had just been someone they fucked. He was always grateful for sex, so if they wanted him, they could have him. But then there was something sappy and stupid about him that made him think just because she came over him, she might care for him a little, have a little concern for his well-being and a little consideration for his feelings. And he always felt hurt when it wasn't there. Karma for his own youthful heartlessness, he supposed. But hurt only happens when you expected something. Manus expected nothing from Paula. He didn't expect sex. It was a possibility, but there were other possibilities. He didn't know Paula. She had told him she came from a right-wing family in Sweden and had decided they were all mad when she was young and left when she was a teenager. She said she had two kids. The oldest one was 17, the youngest 11. He didn't know how old Paula was. She was 41. She told him as they ate magic mushrooms in her summer sunroom. They were old mushrooms and had lost lots of their potency, but still, reality revealers for all that. She'd wanted him to go out with her to the bar, but he hated the idea. He liked to know where he stood with a person before he went out with him. She asked him if he would like to look at some stuff on the computer. He didn't. The house had a field beside it with horses in it. All you could see were fields, trees, a large stables, and beyond it the bay. He was content sitting in the sunroom. She seemed keen on getting him to look at the stuff on the computer. Eventually he consented. And the computer was in her bedroom. Nice to be brought into a woman's bedroom. It had been years and years. And here it was, big messy bedroom. Cats and dogs and piles of dirty washing on the floor. Her computer was just a laptop sat in her bed. And she sat on one side and he sat on the other side of the bed. That's your sleeping space for the night, she said, indicating half of the bed. Thanks, he said. He had been unsure where he was to sleep. The sunroom had bakes of tea, so did the living room. But maybe she didn't have much bedding or something. Anyway, it wasn't a dead cert, the sex. But lying next to a woman in her bed was a lovely, desirable thing for Manus to be doing. Sex or not. And they lay next to each other on her bed underneath the sheets. Him in his boxers and her in her pajamas. Not very revealing or sexy pajamas either, so maybe this was her sleep next to men without sex pajamas. Some people went in for that kind of thing. She said something about him having to make things happen, which he interpreted as at least a subconscious come on. Then she asked if it was strange for him being in bed with a woman after so long. The answer gushed out of him instantaneously. It's just fucking wonderful, he said. And she was delighted with the acknowledgement of her powerfulness. She could make this man feel wonderful. They both lay on their sides to face each other. He put his hand out to touch her. Oh, making a play for me now, she said, as though such a scenario had never been envisaged by her. The last thing that could ever have been on her mind when she invited him to her home and then into her bed to spend the night. Oh, making a play for me now, she said. And he said, feels natural enough. And it was. Physically, mentally, emotionally, the two human animals took great pleasure in each other. Her cunt was shaved, her tits were tiny, her smile was broad and innocent. She had the remains of a removed hemorrhoid on her bumhole. For a decade, Manus's sexual experiences had been limited to Jan, who fucked him when she chose, but no matter how high or pleasant the sex made them feel, Jan would manage to distance herself from the act and any feelings it created almost instantaneously. Her method of distancing herself from the act was to express her contempt for him. A quick wipe of her vagina and she could, metaphorically or physically, spit on him. It all left its mark, and at first he was less confident with Paula than he could have been. But his cock slid up and down inside her, and she moaned and groaned and squirmed and squirted, and truthfully, the sex was wonderful. Next day, they went to the woods and collected sticks and made a fire. That night, they watched a movie. When June went to bed, Paula and Manus sat and talked. Paula had been sexually abused as a child. Manus could not cope with what had been done to her as a child. He had seen her as a child the night before in bed, an innocence on her 41-year-old face. It had disconcerted him a little, a psilocybin-induced hallucination. There was no innocence on her 41-year-old face now as they sat alone on her settee in front of the fire. He cried on her feet. Was he Mary Magdalene? Was she Christ? She felt like she had been crucified. She said she had no problem. She sounded sad and bitter. Manus said he had loads of problems. She said she knew. Paula went out then to pick up Bernie, her oldest daughter, and Manus sat staring at the fire. The electricity went off, but he hardly noticed. By the time Bernie and Paula got back, there was still no electricity, and they all just went straight to bed. Paula seemed so detached from him that Manus wondered if he was still to sleep in her bed, or if the sleeping arrangements had been changed. He looked at her questioningly as he entered her bedroom. She seemed non-committal and non-fussed. If he wanted to and had nowhere else to sleep, she would put up with the inconvenience. And he was a little put out if he was an inconvenience, but tentatively got into the other side of the bed. She was exhausted, curled up in a semi-fetus with her back to him. He tried to cuddle up beside her for the warmth and contact. Good night, Manus, she said, like she was drawing a steel blade down to cut his hands off if he dared touch her again. He felt a bit shitty then. No big deal. Just a childish little yearning for a little warmth and contact that he had no right to expect. He smoked a spliff and tried to appreciate what he was experiencing in all its wonder. He was there in the big bed with a beautiful woman. He thought of the many nights he had let alone and dreamed of such a magical happening. But it would be nice if she could just butts her for sitting on. And he lay on his and tried to enjoy what he had. Then Paula said, I don't mean to be cheeky. And Manus thought, oh fuck no. She's going to tell me to get to bed now. She didn't mind him there last night, but now she minded him and was going to tell him to sleep in a dog kennel. Shit. What did he do to people that made them think it was okay to be this way with him? I am finished with you now. I have no further use for you tonight. Could you go? But could you, shit, rub my back? Manus was relieved. He was pleased too that she still had a use for him. He did his best to massage her, and she told him she didn't mind if he sat on top of her to massage her better. So he did that. And the two of them were aroused by the massage, and she says, "If you want a quick shag there, fine, but don't expect much from me." And she pulled her pajamas down, and the sex felt sweet. They fucked till 4. They dozed then, and were woken seconds later by the fire alarm going off. Between Manus and Paula, they managed to turn it off without being snotty or short to each other, even though they were both raggedy from lack of sleep. Next morning, he was a little disconcerted. The sweet sex, marked off in the beginning by her irritated steel blade, and in the end by the fire alarm, kind of threw Manus. Like there should have been something sweet to connect it to, and there wasn't really. Manus brought Sharifa up to Paula's the following weekend. Paula, 3 dogs, 4 cats, and a rabbit, and the surrounding fields filled with horses, bedazzled Sharifa. It was like a circus for her. Then there were the 2 daughters, like older sisters for her. But like older sisters, they soon found a 7-year-old a nuisance. Still, they played for a bit. Manus was still unsure with Paula. He wasn't even sure if they were going to sleep in the same bed again. Paula said something about not doing many one-night stands, but that he might be one of them. She seemed to want to hold that option open. She had read his stories and now saw fit to pull him on his more shameful deeds from decades before. In one story, he had had sex with the girl who was just turned 16. He had been haunted by that action over the years, wondered who Madeline was. He wondered if she became pregnant, how she was affected by compartmentalized, practically atomized like sex. He had no defense for his crimes. That night, Paula kept him up later than he wanted. By 2 o'clock, he wanted to go to sleep, but she would shag away till 4. Next night, as they lay in bed, she refused to touch his dick. She rubbed his belly. It was his pet hate. A woman touching his belly and his thighs, but refusing to touch his dick. All sexed out babes, she said. He hated it. Took more effort to raise her hands away from his dick. Why couldn't she just give it a little squeeze? But no, it wasn't a power thing, she said, but he still didn't understand. She wasn't, as it turned out, too sexed out to be touched herself. She twisted and squirmed as he nibbled her clit and poked and prodded with his fingers and his tongue, but she couldn't touch him. She came, and he felt pathetic as he wanked himself off beside her. If she noticed, she didn't seem to care. He didn't see her for a week or so after that until she sent him a text. "Miss your face, your voice, your touch." He went back the next Friday. On Saturday night, after licking her for some time, he asked her to take him in the mouth. She refused. The sex stopped, and he asked her why she hadn't wanted to please him. She said she found it worrying that he should ask such a question. If someone didn't want to do something, it was worrying that someone else should ask them why. Manus didn't understand. There was animosity in her voice as she explained. She had been giving blowjobs since she was 7 years old. Manus felt sick and sorry. Next night, she sat checking her Facebook page in bed. He asked if she wanted to touch or hold hands. She didn't. She went on about only getting to know him and finding it worrying that he would question her decision to have no physical contact as they lay in bed. She often lay in bed with friends who never presumed any rights of contact. Perhaps, she suggested, they should end the sex aspect of their relationship so he wasn't confused or hurt or disappointed when she said no. She liked to talk in ultimatums with him. He just nodded. They probably weren't suited. She read out a couple of chapters of Atomized. Then she lay closer and touched him. She joked that if he didn't want to be touched, she wanted to know why. He didn't laugh. "What happens if I grab you?" he asked, and she says, "Oh, so you want to play the grabbing game." And they played the grabbing game, and part of him understood. There was a detachment in her grabbing game. They were 2 human animals wanting physical pleasure, but they weren't 2 fully human animals. Physical contact had nothing to do with mental or emotional contact. Paula seemed happy with that, like they were superhuman animals, detached from their minds and emotions. Paula came out and hugged him as Manus and Sharifa got on the bus the next day. Big of her, maybe, as she wasn't a very tactile person. Manus contacted Paula once more after that, but she said she wanted no more contact and didn't feel the necessity of an explanation. Manus didn't blame himself or Paula. He knew it was just her life experiences and where she was now at and how she reacted to him. He knew he wasn't the worst, and he hoped someday to meet someone else who would know it too, but he wouldn't be holding his breath waiting. Manus started bringing booklets made by the Shell to Sea crew down to the Doyle. It saved them postage money, and as he went to deliver them, he used to stick up little flyers saying, "Socialism, freedom equals anarchy," and "How much more will you take? Make the rich pay." And "If you think capitalism is working, ask someone who isn't," and "Stop wasting resources, free public transport for everyone." Someone once said something about because we can do so little, we do nothing at all. Bringing booklets to the Doyle, asking why some corporation owned Ireland's gas reserves, and fly posting anarchist messages wasn't much to do, but it actually made him feel a little better. A little symbol of resistance to corporate power gave hope for the possibility of a culture which was more fully human, less hierarchical, greedy, wasteful, and abusive.